On Christmas Day, 1066, inside Westminster Abbey, a king sat trembling on his throne while his own guards set fire to the city around him. The congregation was screaming. The Norman soldiers posted outside, hearing the English acclamation they'd never been taught to recognize, mistook the noise for an uprising and began torching the neighboring houses. Smoke poured through the abbey doors. People fled. And William the Conqueror, the man who had just engineered the most consequential military victory in English history, sat alone in the chaos, shaking. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis recorded it without embellishment. William trembled with fear on the day of his own coronation. 19 days before that ceremony, Harold Godwinson had been the greatest military commander in England. He had just destroyed an invading Norwegian fleet of 300 ships. Only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Then, before the celebration was over, he turned his battered army south and marched them into a trap that would end his kingdom, his dynasty, and 500 years of Anglo-Saxon rule in a single October afternoon. 3 documented facts from this battle rewrite everything you think you know. First, the feigned retreats that finally broke the English shield wall were not panic. They were a trained tactic, recorded explicitly by the Norman chronicler William of Poitiers as deliberate, employed twice with precision against a psychological vulnerability Harold could see developing and couldn't stop. Second, Harold almost certainly did not die from an arrow to the eye. None of the world's most famous death scene was physically altered during 19th century French restorations. The earliest written account of the battle, composed within months of the fighting, describes 4 knights hacking Harold apart in the final minutes, possibly including William himself. Third, one afternoon at Senlac Ridge eliminated an entire civilization. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after this battle, recorded that of the thousands of English families who held significant land in 1066, virtually none remained intact by 1086. But here's what historians have never fully resolved. Harold knew exactly what he was walking into. His own brother Gurth begged him not to fight this battle personally. The chronicles document it. Harold had shown strategic patience for months, was outmaneuvering his enemies with care and calculation. Something about standing in the north, hearing that his own ancestral lands in Sussex were burning while he waited, broke a discipline that nothing else had broken. The chronicles hint at it. They never explain it. To understand why a man who had never made a reckless military decision made the one that cost him everything, we need to go back to January 5th, 1066, and the deathbed of a childless king whose final whispered words set 3 empires in motion toward each other. King Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, 1066, at Westminster, and in dying created the most dangerous power vacuum in English history. Edward had ruled since 1042, and throughout those 24 years, his childlessness had functioned not as a failure, but as a political tool. He reportedly promised the English throne to at least 2 different parties at different moments. A habit of diplomatic ambiguity that, while perhaps useful for managing allies during his lifetime, left behind a succession crisis with no clean resolution and multiple parties who believed, with varying degrees of legitimacy, that the crown was rightfully theirs. The immediate question was brutal in its simplicity. Who rules England now? And the immediate answer was that 3 powerful men had 3 credible, contradictory answers. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was the most powerful non-royal figure in the kingdom. He served as what contemporaries called the sub-regulus, the deputy king, and had effectively administered England's day-to-day governance for years. His claim rested on 2 pillars: Edward's deathbed nomination, the witnessed by those present at Westminster, and the approval of the Witenagemot, the assembly of England's nobles and churchmen. Both Anglo-Saxon sources confirm these events. The problem was what Harold had allegedly done in Normandy 2 years earlier. In 1064, the exact circumstances remain disputed by historians. Harold traveled to the court of William, Duke of Normandy. Norman sources, including the Bayeux Tapestry and the Chronicle of William of Poitiers, assert that Harold swore a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. This oath is depicted on the tapestry in striking visual detail. Harold's hands resting on what appears to be a reliquary, William watching from an elevated seat. Anglo-Saxon sources do not record this oath. Historians note that Harold may have arrived in Normandy under duress, possibly shipwrecked at Ponthieu and handed over to William, which would raise serious questions about the oath's validity, even if made. Whether it happened, and whether it was binding, remains genuinely contested. What is not contested is that William believed he had grounds to act on it. Harold Hardrada of Norway presented a third claim, grounded in an agreement between his predecessor Magnus the Good and the earlier English king Harthacnut. If either died without heir, the other would inherit both kingdoms. It was a tenuous basis for invasion. But Hardrada was a formidable warrior who had fought across the Mediterranean and the Russian steppe, and he was prepared to enforce weak claims with overwhelming force. The speed of Harold's coronation tells its own story. He was crowned on January 6th, the same day as Edward's funeral, in the very abbey where Edward was being buried. This was unprecedented in English history and recognized as such at the time. World History Encyclopedia notes that the rapidity smacked of getting the deed done before too much argument broke out amongst rival claimants. Harold was the first English monarch crowned at Westminster Abbey. He was also, though he didn't know it yet, the last Anglo-Saxon king England would ever have. There was a fourth claimant, Edgar Atheling, great-nephew of Edward the Confessor and the strongest hereditary claimant by blood. He was approximately 14 years old, had no military power, and no significant political support. The Witenagemot passed him over without serious debate, and history would mostly treat him as a footnote, and he would outlive Harold by nearly 60 years, surrendering to William in December 1066 and spending the rest of his long life as an honored, harmless guest at the Norman court. Harold had the crown. He also had 3 enemies who wanted it. And within weeks, 2 of them would begin building armies. Harold Godwinson was approximately 44 years old when he became King of England, and he was, by any honest measure, the most capable man in the kingdom. He was born around 1022 into the Godwin family, the most powerful non-royal dynasty in Anglo-Saxon England. His father Godwin had been made Earl of Wessex by the Danish king Nut, which meant Harold's heritage was more complicated than the label last Anglo-Saxon king suggests. Through his mother Geitha, Harold had direct connections to the Danish royal house, and he was simultaneously England's most English king and one of its most Scandinavian. A hybrid of cultures in a kingdom that had spent 2 centuries being shaped by Viking settlement and Danish rule. EBSCO's research starters describe Harold as moderately tall, strong, and athletic, with the blonde hair and flowing mustache of a Viking type, reasonable, congenial, and persuasive in council, if sometimes impatient in military situations. Britannica calls him simply a strong ruler and skilled general, which is perhaps the most honest 2-word summary of a man whose military record before 1066 was genuinely impressive. Harold had conducted successful campaigns against the Welsh prince Gruffydd ap Llywelyn between 1062 and 1063, a war that ended with Gruffydd's defeat and death, or he had served as Edward's deputy king for years, managing the kingdom's administration and military with evident competence. He was not a man who stumbled into power. He had earned it through demonstrated ability across 2 decades of service. The army Harold brought to Hastings reflected both his strengths and his constraints. Modern historians estimate his force at approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men, a range that most scholarly sources broadly accept, though some suggest figures between 5,000 and 13,000. That force was built around 2 fundamentally different components. The housecarls were his professional corps, full-time warriors, many of them retainers of the king or high earls, equipped with mail hauberks, conical helmets, and kite shields. They were arguably the finest heavy infantry in Western Europe. Their signature weapon, the 2-handed Danish war axe, could in a single blow sever a horse's head or cut through mail armor that had taken years to forge. Contemporary sources on both sides describe the housecarls with the kind of respect that military professionals reserve for genuine peers. The fyrd provided the necessary mass, a national levy of land-owning freemen, organized by obligation to the crown. The thanes, landed gentry, arrived reasonably equipped, with swords and shields and varying degrees of military experience. The rank-and-file fyrdsmen were more variable. Some were veterans of local defense. Others arrived with farm implements pressed into service as weapons. Harold's critical structural weakness was his almost complete absence of archers. And this wasn't a tactical choice. It was a consequence of circumstances. His rapid movement south from Yorkshire meant his missile troops simply couldn't keep pace. The Bayeux Tapestry's famous image of a single English archer surrounded by many Norman ones is not artistic license. It is documented military reality, confirmed by multiple sources. Harold would arrive at Senlac Ridge with the finest infantry in Europe and almost no ability to suppress enemy missile troops or engage at range. He had also married strategically in the months before the crisis. His long-term common-law relationship with Edith Swan Neck, with whom he had several children, was not recognized by the church. In early 1066, faced with the need for northern support, Harold contracted a formal marriage with Ealdgyth, sister of the northern earls Edwin and Morcar. It was a political union designed to secure the alliances his kingdom would need. Those alliances would prove critical, and then, at the crucial moment, absent. Harold was formidable. His army was formidable. Waiting for him across the channel was a man who had spent 9 months preparing for this exact confrontation. They called him William the Bastard, and his enemies meant it as an insult. He was born around 1028 as the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and Herleva, the daughter of a tanner from Falaise. The circumstances of his birth, which placed him permanently outside the clean lines of legitimate succession, would shape every decade of his life and every calculation of his ambition. And Robert I died in 1035, returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and William became Duke of Normandy at the age of 7. What followed was a childhood that would have destroyed a lesser character. His guardians were murdered. Assassination attempts were made on the child duke himself. Baronial factions fought for control of his fragile dukedom. The illegitimacy that his enemies mocked became, paradoxically, his strongest motivation. Because a man who started with nothing except a contested title and a dead father had no choice but to become extraordinary to survive. By 1066, the English Heritage Assessment describes him with unambiguous precision. Tall and exceptionally strong, with a loud, harsh voice and a frightening appearance. Loyal to the church, reportedly faithful to his wife Matilda of Flanders, and capable of extraordinary cruelty when political necessity demanded it. Britannica calls him one of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the Middle Ages, and the record supports that assessment. He had defeated rebellious Norman nobles throughout the 1040s. He repelled 2 French invasions, at Mortimer in 1054 and Varaville in 1057. He conquered Maine between 1062 and 1064 and destabilized Brittany. By the time Edward the Confessor died, William had spent 20 years in near continuous warfare and had won most of it. The preparation he committed to for the English invasion was staggering in its ambition. He spent 9 months assembling a fleet from essentially nothing. A contemporary document claims 776 ships, though historians regard this as likely inflated. Modern estimates suggest roughly 600 ships. He recruited volunteers from Brittany, Flanders, Aquitaine, Maine, and France, attracting them with the promise of English land and what William of Poitiers records as papal backing. Though historians note this claim appears only in Poitiers' account and not in more contemporary sources, making its authenticity genuinely uncertain. Whether he had genuine papal sanction or simply presented his invasion as having it, the religious framing served his recruitment. The army that crossed the Channel was something qualitatively different from Harold's force. Where Harold had infantry and almost nothing else, William brought what modern military historians recognize as genuine combined arms. Archers and crossbowmen in the front line, capable of suppressing defenders and depleting ammunition. The heavy infantry in the middle, providing the grinding pressure of sustained close combat. And cavalry in the rear, 3 divisions, Normans at center, Bretons on the left, Franco-Flemish forces on the right, capable of decisive shock action when gaps appeared. Modern consensus places his force at approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men, including 1,000 to 2,000 cavalry, which means the armies were probably roughly equal in size. The decisive difference was not numbers, but capability. William could not speak English. Contemporary sources suggest he may have been illiterate. He would transform the English language more than any person before or since. A paradox that the history of conquest produces with unsettling regularity. He had waited since 1051, now when Edward the Confessor reportedly first designated him as heir, for the moment that finally arrived in the autumn of 1066. He had built a fleet, gathered a multinational army, secured diplomatic support, and crossed a body of water that had defeated invasion attempts for centuries. What he needed was wind. In late September, the wind changed. The Battle of Hastings did not begin on October 14th. It began 9 months earlier, with a king learning to fight a war on 2 fronts simultaneously. And it ran through 3 major engagements across 3 different parts of England before the armies even reached Senlac Ridge. Understanding what happened on that October afternoon requires understanding what came before it. Because Harold Godwinson arrived at Hastings not fresh and prepared, but depleted, exhausted, and commanding a force that had already fought one of the most remarkable military actions of the 11th century less than 3 weeks earlier. In early September 1066, Harold had his attention fixed south. He had spent months on the Sussex coast with a substantial army and fleet, watching for William's invasion that hadn't come. By harvest time, with provisions running short and his militia unable to remain in the field indefinitely, he stood them down and sent the fleet to London. Within days, catastrophic news arrived from the north. Harold Hardrada, the last of the great Viking warlords, said by English heritage to be over 7 feet tall, whose battle flag was called Land Waster, had sailed from Norway with an estimated fleet of 300 ships, carrying perhaps 15,000 men. He was joined by Harold's own exiled brother Tostig. Advancing on York via the Humber, Hardrada's forces met the northern English army under Earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th and defeated them with what sources describe as great slaughter. York fell. Hardrada was in control of the north. Harold's response was what English heritage calls one of the most celebrated military movements in medieval history. He covered approximately 185 miles from London to Yorkshire in 4 to 5 days, a pace that would have been remarkable even with modern infrastructure. He caught Hardrada's army completely off guard at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The Norwegians had left their armor at their ships, miles away, expecting to receive hostages and tribute from a defeated English kingdom rather than a battle. What they received instead was Harold Godwinson at the height of his military powers, striking before his enemy could prepare. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was total. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson were killed. Of the 300 ships that had carried the Norwegian invasion force to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold had effectively ended the Viking Age in England in a single afternoon. It was the greatest English military victory in a generation. 3 days later, William landed at Pevensey. The sequence is almost unbearably compressed. September 25th, Harold destroys the Norwegian invasion. September 28th, William lands on the Sussex coast, unopposed, and begins building fortifications. Harold received the news while still in York. He now had to bring his battle-worn army south, more than 250 miles, to confront a fresh, rested, fully supplied Norman force that had been in England for 2 weeks already. A note on recent scholarship. The traditional account of Harold's southward movement describes a forced march, a feat of military endurance that historians have called almost miraculous. Research published in 2026 by Professor Tom Licence at the University of East Anglia challenges this narrative, arguing that Harold may have used his fleet, which the traditional account assumed was disbanded, to transport forces south, and may even have attempted a naval pincer movement against William. This is emerging scholarship not yet accepted as consensus, and historians continue to debate it. What is not in debate is the outcome. Harold arrived near Hastings on the evening of October 13th with an army that, by any measure, had been through more in 3 weeks than most medieval forces experienced in a year. The 19-day span between Stamford Bridge and Hastings remains the compressed, brutal heart of 1066. Harold won the most complete Viking defeat in English history. Then he marched, or sailed, or somehow transported his exhausted forces into a second existential confrontation before the first one's dust had settled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, without editorial comment, that Harold fought at Hastings before all the army had come. That single line contains multitudes. When William landed at Pevensey on September 28th and began building fortifications, he faced a strategic problem that had nothing to do with military capability. He needed Harold to come to him, and he needed Harold to come before the English king had gathered his full strength. The solution William chose was calculated and documented. Sussex was Harold Godwinson's personal ancestral earldom, his family's land, his people, his identity as an English nobleman given physical form in fields and villages. William's forces began systematically ravaging it. The Bayeux Tapestry, despite being a Norman document commissioned by William's half-brother Odo, depicts the destruction with notable specificity. Houses burning, a woman and child fleeing, livestock being driven off. William was not simply foraging for supplies. He was sending a message written in smoke and ruin, addressed personally to Harold Godwinson, for Harold's brother Gurth recognized the trap. Chronicles preserve what historians reconstruct as his argument. Let Gurth lead the army south while Harold remained in reserve in London. If Gurth lost, England would still have its king and could continue resistance. If Gurth won, the invasion was defeated without risking the monarch. Historian David Howarth, in his 1981 study of the period, reconstructs an even more elaborate alternative that Gurth reportedly proposed. Harold should implement a scorched earth strategy, emptying the countryside ahead of William, burning villages, destroying food supplies, letting the Norman army starve through winter while Harold gathered the full strength of England in London. Confronting William directly with an exhausted army when a defensive strategy might work was, in Gurth's assessment, unnecessary. Harold refused both alternatives. This is the psychological mystery that sits at the center of October 14th. Harold was not an impulsive commander by nature. He had shown strategic patience for months, managing threats with calculation rather than reaction. Something about the specific combination, his own lands burning, his people suffering while he waited in the north, and the visceral urgency of a second invasion following immediately on the heels of the first, broke a discipline that nothing else had broken. The chronicles note his decision. They don't explain the reasoning behind it, and historians have debated it for nearly 1,000 years. Harold arrived in London around October 5th or 6th. He waited approximately 5 days for reinforcements, specifically for Edwin and Morcar's northern forces to travel south and join the army. They did not come. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's bald statement that Harold fought before all the army had come is confirmed by the absence of Edwin and Morcar from every account of the battle. Harold decided not to wait longer. He moved south without them. The march from London to Sussex took approximately 2 days. Harold's army arrived near the area now known as Battle East Sussex on the evening of October 13th and camped near Caldbeck Hill, the traditional mustering point for the local Sussex militia. Harold placed his banner at what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes memorably as the Hoary Apple Tree, a local landmark that suggests a meeting point known to the regional population. William's scouts detected the English army's arrival immediately. William had his forces ready to march before dawn on October 14th. He had what Harold had tried and failed to achieve at Stamford Bridge. The element of surprise reversed. Harold had wanted to catch William off guard, as he'd caught Hardrada. Instead, William's scouts reported Harold's approach while the English army was still forming. William marched first. By approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, his forces were at Telham Hill, barely a mile from Harold's position. Harold had to fight where he stood or retreat. He chose to fight. He advanced to Senlac Ridge and began deploying his army in the position that would define everything that followed. The ground Harold chose was as good as any ground an infantry commander without cavalry could hope to find in the rolling Sussex countryside. Senlac Ridge ran roughly east to west, a crest approximately 400 yards long, about 365 meters, that rose perhaps 60 feet above the approaches from the south. The flanks dropped away steeply on both sides, anchored by woodland on the eastern end, and marshy, boggy ground that would have made cavalry movement treacherous. In front of the ridge, the slope fell away toward the valley below, where William's army would have to assemble and advance. Behind Harold's position, the forest of Andreadsweld stretched northward, an exit route if disaster came. Though retreating into heavy forest with cavalry in pursuit was a desperate option rather than a planned one. Modern visitors to Battle Abbey will note that the slope has been significantly altered by centuries of construction. English heritage acknowledges that the gradient was steeper in 1066 than it appears today. Battle Abbey's construction, beginning in the 1070s, involved leveling and building that permanently changed the topography. The ridge Harold's housecarls stood on was harder to charge than the gentle incline visible from the current visitor trail. Norman cavalry attempting to charge uphill against prepared infantry were doing something considerably more dangerous than it might appear to modern eyes. Harold deployed his forces in the only formation that made sense for an infantry army without archers or cavalry. A solid shield wall, dense and overlapping, with his best troops at the front. The housecarls, his professional corps, took position at the center, surrounding Harold's personal standard. Contemporary accounts describe the standard as depicting a fighting warrior, and it served the same function as all military standards, as a rally point, a morale anchor, and a signal visible across the chaos of battle. Harold placed himself and his most experienced men precisely where the Norman assault would be heaviest. The fyrd filled the wings and extended the line. The thanes with their swords and shields stood relatively close to the housecarl corps. The less experienced fyrdsmen extended outward, their equipment more variable, their discipline less certain. Britannica notes that Harold's army, lacking archers and cavalry, prepared for defense on the protected summit of the ridge. The formulation is exact. Harold had almost no tactical options available beyond holding the ground he'd chosen. William's deployment was its mirror image in complexity. He arranged his three arms in sequence: archers and crossbowmen in the front, capable of opening fire from range; heavy infantry in the second line; cavalry in 3 divisions to the rear, divided by contingent; Normans in the center under William's direct command; Bretons on the left; Franco-Flemish forces on the right. Each arm was designed to complement the others. If the archers suppressed the defenders and created disorder, the infantry could press the disorganized line, and the cavalry could exploit any gaps that opened. It was a system with multiple redundancies and multiple ways to win. The physics of the coming engagement were straightforward when Norman trumpets sounded at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, October 14th, 1066. Sunset that evening was recorded, with the precision of modern astronomical calculation applied to historical dates, at 4:54 in the afternoon. Full darkness would follow by 6:24. William had, at most, 8 hours to break a prepared shield wall on high ground before darkness ended his advantage. Harold had 8 hours to hold a line that was already undermanned and missing its archers. Everything that followed flowed from those two realities and the ground between them. The battle opened with the sound that medieval armies had learned to fear across 2 centuries of warfare: the sustained whistle of mass archery, arrows rising in arcs against the October sky. Norman archers advanced to approximately 100 yards from the English lines, close enough for effective shooting, far enough to stay outside the range of the housecarls' axes, and began their volleys. William of Poitiers, writing within approximately a decade of the battle, preserves what the English position looked like from the Norman perspective, noting that the English were greatly helped by the advantage of the high ground. That was diplomatic understatement. The archers were shooting uphill against a dense, overlapping shield wall composed of men who had been fighting wars for years. The incline reduced arrow velocity. The shields deflected what reached them. Many shafts flew over the ridge entirely, carrying their momentum harmlessly into the sky beyond. What the opening barrage revealed, almost immediately, was a structural problem that would define the entire engagement. The English had almost no archers to respond. In normal practice, defending archers would suppress attacking missile troops, force them to seek cover, and reduce the sustained pressure of their volleys. They would also recover spent enemy arrows and return them. At Hastings, the Normans could shoot continuously with minimal counterfire. The Bayeux Tapestry's now famous visual of a single English archer surrounded by many Norman ones is not artistic choice or propaganda emphasis. It is an accurate depiction of the battlefield reality that multiple sources confirm. Despite holding this structural advantage, the Norman archers failed to break or seriously damage the English formation. The shield wall absorbed the arrow storm with a stubbornness that contemporary accounts found remarkable. Harold's housecarls used their large shields with practiced efficiency, angling them to deflect rather than absorb. a technique developed through generations of English military experience. The opening gambit, which in other battles might have shattered morale or created visible gaps for infantry to exploit, produced neither effect. William committed his heavy infantry next. They advanced uphill against the shield wall and met the housecarls' axes. William of Poitiers records that the English killed and maimed many, which, from a Norman chronicler with every incentive to minimize English effectiveness, is significant testimony. The two-handed Danish axe, swung in a full arc by a trained warrior, was capable of cutting through a Norman infantryman's shield and the arm holding it in a single stroke. Medieval accounts from multiple campaigns document this weapon's capacity to cleave through mail armor and to sever the heads of horses. The Normans advancing uphill were discovering exactly why Harold's housecarls were considered the finest heavy infantry in Western Europe. The cavalry charges that followed produced the engagement's first genuine crisis. Not for Harold, but for William. Mounted Norman knights charging uphill against an intact shield wall found themselves in circumstances that negated their momentum advantage. Britannica records that the cavalry was so badly mauled by English infantry wielding two-handed battle axes that it panicked and fled. This was not feigned retreat. This was genuine, unplanned, a dangerous flight. The Breton division on the Norman left broke in real disorder, beginning to stream away from the ridge. A rumor spread through the retreating Norman forces with the speed and destructive power of fire in dry grass. William was dead. The Battle of Hastings came close to ending before noon, with a Norman collapse in the first 3 hours. What prevented it was an act of personal leadership that 3 independent sources, the Carmen de Hastingai Proelio, William of Poitiers, and the Bayeux Tapestry, Onda de Nastuina, all confirm in their different ways. William rode through his retreating forces, removed his helmet to show his face alive, and addressed his army. The tapestry depicts the moment explicitly. The Duke with helmet raised, his half-brother Bishop Odo beside him pointing toward the battle, the message unmistakable. The Duke lives. Turn back. They turned back. And in the chaos of the genuine retreat, William had just observed something that would win him the kingdom. When the Breton division broke and genuinely fled in the battle's first hours, something happened on Harold's right wing that was small in scale and enormous in consequence. Some of the English herdsmen, seeing what appeared to be a Norman rout, emboldened by the apparent collapse of the enemy, after hours of successfully absorbing everything the Normans could throw at them, broke from the shield wall and pursued the retreating troops downhill. They were not housecarls. They were not professional warriors trained to hold position regardless of what they saw. They were landowning freemen who had spent the morning watching their friends and neighbors die absorbing Norman charges, and who now saw what looked like the beginning of victory. The instinct to pursue a fleeing enemy is not cowardice. It is the most natural military impulse in the world. It is also, on that particular October morning, what began to lose Harold the battle. William's cavalry counterattacked the exposed English pursuers on the level ground below the ridge. Without the formation protection of the shield wall, without the elevation advantage of the crest, without even the psychological solidarity of standing shoulder to shoulder with their compatriots, the herdsmen who had broken ranks were cut down. The surviving accounts don't record how many were lost in this initial episode. It was probably not a catastrophic number. But the precedent established was catastrophic in implication. William, watching from his position in the Norman center, had just seen the proof of something he could now exploit deliberately. When the English broke formation to pursue, they died. A lull settled over the battlefield, probably in the late morning or early afternoon. Both armies needed it. men who have been in sustained close combat for 3 hours, carrying heavy armor, swinging axes and swords, absorbing blows on shields and mail, are approaching the limits of human physical endurance. The Normans needed time to reorganize their formations and address the near collapse of their left. Harold needed time to reinforce his line where the right wing's Fyrdsmen had thinned it. What William needed most was a new strategy, because the old one had demonstrably failed. Archers shooting uphill had not broken the shield wall. Infantry advancing uphill had not broken the shield wall. The cavalry charging uphill had nearly broken the Norman army instead. The shield wall was still there, still solid, still anchored by housecarls with axes who had proven their quality beyond reasonable doubt. Military historians analyzing William's options in that afternoon lull emphasized that the combination of terrain and English discipline had, in theory, made Harold's position nearly impregnable to conventional assault. The shield wall that fought defensively on high ground, maintained its formation, and refused to pursue was an equation that Norman doctrine had no standard answer for. But Harold's men were human. Exhaustion was real. The morning's fighting had already cost Fyrdsmen on the right, and William had just witnessed, in the episode of the genuine Breton retreat, that the shield wall's integrity depended on the discipline of every man who composed it. Not just the housecarls who would have held regardless, but the Fyrdsmen who had shown they could be induced to break. The lull ended. Norman trumpets sounded again. What came next was not a repeat of the morning's assault. It was something different, a tactic that the Normans had used in other battles, that required the kind of training and discipline that William's professional cavalry possessed, and that was specifically designed to exploit the one vulnerability Harold's formation had revealed. William of Poitiers is explicit. The feigned retreat was not an accident, not a rationalization for panic, and not a single opportunistic maneuver. It was used twice, deliberately, in the afternoon phase of the battle. Most historians accept Poitiers' account on this point, noting that Norman armies had used the feigned retreat in other engagements. It was a trained tactic requiring controlled cavalry capable of executing what appears to be a genuine rout, while maintaining the cohesion to wheel and counterattack on command. Doing this once under battle conditions is difficult. Doing it twice, successfully, against the same opponent, requires exactly the kind of professional discipline that distinguished William's mounted knights from less trained cavalry. The mechanism was precise in its psychology. Norman cavalry units would advance toward the shield wall, engage briefly, and then appear to break, not the practiced, controlled withdrawal of a unit executing a planned maneuver, but the visible, panic-stricken flight of men who believed the battle was lost. For Fyrdsmen who had spent hours holding their position through genuine assault after genuine assault, who were physically exhausted and emotionally primed to see Norman weakness in any retreat, the sight was irresistible. Sections of the English line, not the housecarls who held, but the feared soldiers on the wings who had been watching for this moment all day, broke formation and poured downhill in pursuit. William of Poitiers describes what happened to them without sentiment. The Normans, suddenly wheeling round their horses, checked and encircled them and slaughtered them to the last man. On the level ground below the ridge, away from the formation protection that had kept them alive all morning. The pursuing Fyrdsmen were trapped between cavalry coming from multiple directions and had no equivalent force to countercharge. The shield wall that had been impenetrable became, piece by piece, an outline of its former self as sections of it chased what they thought was victory and found the opposite. The second feigned retreat was more consequential than the first. In its aftermath, Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine were both killed. The precise timing and circumstances of their deaths are not specified with confidence in the sources. Some historians associate them with the feigned retreat engagements. Others place them earlier. What matters is the documented outcome. Harold was now commanding alone. The two most experienced subordinate commanders in the English force were gone, and the shield wall had contracted as sections of the fyrd on the wings were destroyed. The housecarls at the center still held, still stood, still represented one of the most formidable defensive formations in European warfare. But the formation was thinning, and the men composing it had been fighting for the better part of a day. The psychological dynamic that the feigned retreats exploited deserves acknowledgement beyond simple criticism of fyrd discipline. These were not cowards or fools. They were men who had absorbed hours of assault, who had watched their companions killed, who had seen genuine Norman retreat in the morning's chaos, and who, in the afternoon's exhaustion, could not always distinguish the genuine from the simulated. The feigned retreat worked not because English soldiers were weak, but because it was designed to exploit a truth about human nature that holds regardless of era. Soldiers who believe they are winning fight differently than soldiers who believe they are losing. William used that truth as a weapon, repeatedly, until the shield wall that Harold had spent the morning defending was something considerably less than it had been at 9 o'clock. What came next was the last phase. The housecarls at the center held. Harold's standard still flew. The light was beginning to change. October afternoon, the sun dropping toward the southwest, shadows lengthening across the blood-soaked ridge, and Norman archers received new orders. In the late afternoon, William changed his archer's angle of fire. Moreover, the 12th century chronicler Henry of Huntingdon records that William instructed his archers to shoot high, not directly at the shield wall, but into the air, so that the arrows would arc upward and come down in plunging trajectories on men who, after hours of fighting, could no longer maintain perfect shield coverage. Whether this account is precisely accurate is debated among historians. Henry of Huntingdon was writing approximately 65 years after the battle, and the tactic may be partly retrospective explanation rather than documented contemporary order. What multiple sources confirm is the outcome. The afternoon arrow storm was more effective than the morning's had been against an intact, rested shield wall. And now we arrive at the most debated specific fact in English military history. The death of King Harold Godwinson is simultaneously the most famous event of the Battle of Hastings and the one most thoroughly obscured by its own legend. The arrow in the eye story has been taught to English schoolchildren for generations. It was established by the Bayeux Tapestry's famous scene. The inscription reading, "Hic Harold Rex interfectus est." Here, King Harold is killed. And beneath it, a figure clutching what appears to be an arrow protruding from his face. The problem, which historians have documented in considerable detail, is that this arrow was not original. Scholars examining the tapestry's restoration history have established that 18th century engravings, including Benoit's 1729 sketch of the same scene, show the identical figure holding a spear shaft, not an arrow. The conversion of the object from spear to arrow occurred during 19th century French repairs to the tapestry. Charles Stothard's 1818 watercolor is the first historical record showing an arrow. The restorers appear to have altered the textile to match later literary traditions rather than preserving what the original 11th century embroiderers had stitched. Equally significant is what the earliest documentary sources actually say. The Carmen de Hastingai Proelio, attributed to Guy, Bishop of Amiens, and believed by most historians to have been composed between Christmas 1066 and Easter 1067, making it the earliest extended written account of the battle, contains no mention of any arrow striking Harold. None at all. Neither does William of Jumièges, writing in the late 1060s. The arrow story does not appear in any written source until approximately 40 to 60 years after the battle. What the Carmen does record is considerably more brutal. 4 knights broke through to Harold in the battle's final phase. The poem names them and describes what they did in graphic detail. The first pierced Harold through the chest with a lance. The second beheaded him with a sword. The third disemboweled him with a spear. The fourth, in a euphemism that historians have decoded as referring to mutilation of a more personal kind, cut away a part of Harold's body and carried it some distance. Harold was so completely destroyed that initial identification of his body was impossible. This is where a detail enters the record that carries the weight of genuine human tragedy. According to multiple sources that align with the Carmen's account of Harold's mutilation, Edith Swan Neck, Harold's common-law wife of approximately 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman he had set aside for a political marriage to Ealdgyth earlier in 1066, was brought to the battlefield the following day to identify him. She could identify him, the sources record, by intimate marks on his body that no one else would know. William of Poitiers, who had every reason to describe William's role in Harold's death if it reflected well on his master, says nothing at all about how Harold died. His silence on the subject, in an account that is otherwise detailed and laudatory, is treated by historians as potentially significant. A death by squad killing, potentially involving the king himself hacking apart an anointed monarch, was not a story that Norman propaganda needed to preserve. Harold's death shattered what remained of English resistance. The housecarls made a final stand around the fallen standard. They were overwhelmed. By sunset, the field belonged to William of Normandy. The English army dissolved rather than surrendered. Harold's death removed the one element that had held the shield wall's remnants together after 8 hours of attrition. The housecarls who had survived, professional warriors whose code demanded they fight to the last around their fallen king, were cut down where they stood. The herdsmen who remained had no formation to shelter in, no leadership to rally to, no strategic position left to defend. Also the forest of Andreadswald lay behind them, and they ran for it as the Norman cavalry came over the ridge in the gathering dusk. The pursuit lasted until darkness made it impossible. Sunset on October 14th was recorded at 4:54 in the afternoon, with full darkness following by 6:24. William's cavalry chased the fleeing English for some distance south and east. Exactly how far is not specified with precision in the sources. Before the October night terminated the pursuit as effectively as any rearguard action could have. But the day was not quite over, and the English were not quite finished. Multiple sources record an incident in the battle's aftermath that the Chronicle of Battle Abbey calls the Malfosse, evil ditch, and describes with language that suggests both horror and a kind of grim satisfaction. During the pursuit, some contingent of English survivors, whether deliberate fighters making a final stand or simply men who could run no further, were at or near a large ditch or earthwork in the darkening landscape. Pursuing Norman cavalry, moving fast through unfamiliar terrain in failing light, fell into this ditch in numbers. The Chronicle of Battle Abbey describes the aftermath as producing rivulets of blood as far as one could see. Historians classify the incident as semi-legendary in its details. The location cannot be precisely identified archaeologically, but it appears in enough independent sources that its basic occurrence is accepted as probable. The English who survived Hastings that night killed more Normans in a ditch than many units had managed all day. But what is documented without dispute is the human cost among the Norman leadership. Eustace of Boulogne, one of William's key commanders, named in the Carmen as one of the 4 knights present at Harold's killing, was seriously wounded at the Malfosse. He survived, but the incident demonstrated that October 14th extracted a price from the victors that the clean narrative of decisive Norman triumph sometimes obscures. On October 15th, the day after the battle, Harold's body was recovered from the field. The precise method of identification varies between sources. Some say by his armor, others by marks on his body. And the tradition that Edith Swan Neck was brought to the battlefield and identified Harold by intimate signs known only to her is present in accounts that align with the Carman's description of Harold's mutilation. And it implies that whatever the Normans did to Harold's body in the battle's final minutes, the damage was sufficient to prevent recognition by face. Harold's personal standard was given to William and, according to later accounts, sent to the papacy as evidence of the conquest's divine sanction. The king's brothers Gurth and Leofwine lay dead on the field. Most of the housecarl professional corps, England's military backbone, warriors who had taken generations to train, were dead around their fallen king's standard. In the Anglo-Saxon military tradition that had defeated Viking invasion after Viking invasion for 2 centuries, had been destroyed not by a single overwhelming blow, but by 8 hours of attrition, 2 feigned retreats, and 1 moment in the late afternoon when Harold fell. William rested his army for approximately 5 days before beginning the march north. The numbers historians attach to the Battle of Hastings carry the characteristic uncertainty of all medieval casualty records. They are estimates built on estimates, derived from accounts written by people who either weren't present or had strong reasons to shape what they recorded. No primary source provides reliable casualty figures. Contemporary chronicles are either silent on specifics or wildly exaggerated. One account claims 60,000 men on William's side alone. The most commonly cited modern estimate, appearing across multiple scholarly sources, suggests approximately 2,000 Norman dead and approximately 4,000 English dead, producing a casualty ratio of roughly 2 to 1 in Norman favor. Some sources suggest English losses were higher. One estimate of 5,000 of 7,500 English killed. All of these figures should be understood as rough approximations rather than documented counts. The honest position, which the evidence supports, is that we know the battle was costly for both sides. Significantly more costly for the English, and beyond that, we are estimating. What the battle's duration tells us more reliably than any body count is the quality of the English resistance. 8 hours of sustained combat in a medieval engagement was exceptional. Most medieval battles ended in 1 to 3 hours, either through decisive breakthrough or through one side's collapse under sustained pressure. The shield wall held through archers, infantry, genuine cavalry panic, and the deliberate erosion of feigned retreats for the better part of a working day. Harold's housecarls, fighting exhausted on a ridge they'd reached after the most punishing 3 weeks in the English military calendar, were formidable enough to make William fight all day for a victory that his numbers and combined arms should have delivered faster. The qualitative losses on the English side were irreplaceable in ways that the quantitative figures can't fully capture. The housecarls who died around Harold's standard represented the professional core of English military power. Men whose training, experience, and institutional knowledge could not be quickly rebuilt. Harold was dead. Gurth was dead. Leofwine was dead. Edwin and Morcar, whose forces had never arrived, would find themselves in an England that no longer had a functional military leadership structure to organize around. William founded Battle Abbey on the battlefield, with its high altar placed, according to tradition, confirmed by 12th century sources, on the exact spot where Harold fell. English heritage notes that the foundation was more likely imposed on William by papal legates in 1070 rather than arising purely from personal vow, which adds a note of political calculation to what is sometimes presented as penitential piety. The Harold Stone, a simple rectangular plaque set into the earth at the abbey's traditional altar site, marks the spot today. Visitors can stand there. The slope that made the Norman cavalry's morning charges so difficult is still recognizable in the abbey's grounds, though altered by construction. The weight of what happened on that ground is present in a way that battlefields from the ancient world often aren't. Close enough in time to feel connected, far enough to be history. The battle was over. The conquest had barely begun. William was a patient man. He had been patient for 15 years, since Edward the Confessor's first apparent promise of the English throne. He had been patient through 9 months of fleet building and army gathering. He was patient now, resting his forces for approximately 5 days after Hastings before beginning his march, consolidating his immediate position, securing what he needed before reaching for what he wanted. His first targets were not London, but the infrastructure of English resistance. He moved to secure Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester, the last being where the royal treasury was located. Capturing the treasury before anyone could move it was not sentiment. It was logistics. An army in a foreign country operating without pay is an army that dissolves. William was cutting off Harold's surviving supporters' lines of retreat, securing his own line back to the Channel, and demonstrating to the English nobility that the Normans were not a raiding force that would eventually go home, but an occupying power with strategic intent. The English aristocracy attempted to continue. Edgar Atheling, the 14-year-old with the strongest hereditary claim, whom the Witenagemot had passed over in January in favor of Harold, was proclaimed king by the surviving clergy and magnates in London. William the Conqueror's Wikipedia entry describes Edgar's support as only lukewarm, which is a diplomatic way of saying that the people proclaiming him knew they were proclaiming a symbol rather than a solution. Edgar had no army. His northern supporters were Edwin and Morcar, who had not come south for Hastings and were not positioned to defend London effectively against a victorious Norman force. William's strategy for London mirrored his strategy for Sussex. If Harold won't come to you, make his position untenable. He marched in a wide arc around the city, burning the surrounding countryside, cutting supply routes, demonstrating systematically that no relief was coming and no resistance was sustainable. By December 1066, the English resistance collapsed without a final battle. Edgar Atheling, Edwin and Morcar, Archbishop Stigand, and the leading men of London submitted to William at Berkhamsted. England had a new king. William was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. The ceremony was planned to be solemn, historically resonant, establishing a legitimate connection between Norman Duke and English throne through the same rituals that had crowned Harold 11 months earlier. What happened instead is one of history's more remarkable moments of farce, embedded in triumph. When the English congregation inside the abbey responded to the traditional coronation questions with the traditional acclamations, shouts of approval that were the customary way the people signified acceptance of their new monarch, the Norman soldiers posted outside heard the noise and reached the wrong conclusion. Unfamiliar with English ceremony, possibly on edge in a recently conquered capital, they interpreted the shouting as the beginning of an uprising. They set fire to the neighboring houses. Smoke filled Westminster Abbey. The congregation fled. Orderic Vitalis, the chronicler who provides our most detailed and relatively balanced account of the Norman conquest, half English by birth and therefore somewhat less invested in Norman triumphalism than Poitiers, records that William sat on his throne trembling with fear, meant the most powerful man in England, alone in a smoke-filled church on the day of his greatest achievement, shaking. England had a new king. It was about to discover what that actually meant. William's coronation did not end the resistance. It reframed it. For the next 5 years, rebellions rose and fell across England. in Kent, in the Midlands, in the West, and most dangerously in the North, where the combination of English regional identity and Danish military support produced the most serious challenge to Norman authority after Hastings itself. In 1069, a coalition that included Edgar Atheling, northern English nobles, and a substantial Danish invasion fleet retook York. William's response to this rebellion defines his reign in ways that his victory at Hastings does not, because it reveals what he was willing to do to secure what he had won. He divided his army into small raiding parties with specific, systematic orders. They burned crops. They slaughtered livestock. They destroyed the agricultural tools, plows, harrows, equipment essential for working the land, that would be needed not just for that year's harvest, but for the following year's planting. They were not raiding. They were eliminating the agricultural capacity of an entire region with sufficient thoroughness that any survivors of the initial violence would face death by starvation before spring arrived. Contemporary accounts describe survivors selling themselves into slavery to obtain food. Others, according to the chronicles, turned to cannibalism. Orderic Vitalis, who was broadly supportive of William's rule and wrote from within the Norman institutional framework, nonetheless records his horror at what he calls the cruelest act of William's reign. He notes that over 100,000 people died of famine as a result of the harrying. This figure should be understood as a contemporary estimate rather than a documented count, and historians note that Orderic may have exaggerated the scale. What cannot be exaggerated is the corroborating evidence provided by a source with no interest in moral condemnation, the Domesday Book itself. The Domesday Book was commissioned by William in 1086, 20 years after Hastings, as a comprehensive survey of land ownership, agricultural capacity, and taxable assets across England. It was a tax document, produced by royal administrators whose interest was in accurate accounting rather than historical narrative. When those administrators surveyed Yorkshire 2 decades after the harrying, they recorded approximately 60% of the region as vasta, waste, not underused, not fallow, waste, land that had ceased to produce, communities that had ceased to exist, a landscape that had been so thoroughly destroyed that 20 years of recovery had not restored it to productive capacity. This is the evidence that makes Orderic's account impossible to simply dismiss as exaggeration. A royal tax survey, compiled by people who wanted accurate numbers because inaccurate numbers cost the crown revenue, confirms that an entire region of England remained economically devastated 2 decades after William's armies moved through it. The Domesday Book's land ownership data provides the battle's most striking single statistic. Of the thousands of English families who held significant estates in 1066, historians estimate the number in the range of 4,000 to 5,000. Virtually none remained intact by 1086. The Domesday Survey records England as now held by approximately 200 Norman nobles, plus a handful of church institutions. National Geographic's analysis of this data concludes that just 5% of England's wealth remained with English nobles. One October afternoon had not immediately eliminated England's ruling class, but 20 years of systematic policy had completed what that afternoon had begun. History has a way of measuring its own consequences in surprising units. The Battle of Hastings can be measured in lives and land, and historians have done that accounting in detail. But there is another measure that touches every English speaker alive today, that is present in every conversation, every legal proceeding, every political document produced by the civilization that descended from the one William built on Harold's bones. It is the English language itself, and the Battle of Hastings is woven into it at a level deeper than historical influence. It is structural. After 1066, Norman French became the language of the English court, the legal system, the church hierarchy, and the aristocracy. Old English, the language of Beowulf, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of 5 centuries of literary and administrative tradition, was driven underground. Thus it became the language of the people who worked the land, tended the animals, and built the buildings. It was spoken, but not written, valued, but not valued by power. Written English barely reappears in official documents until the 13th century. 300 years passed before English re-emerged as the dominant language of governance. The most elegant trace of that suppression is a linguistic division that linguist Albert Baugh identified in his foundational study of English history: the animal and meat doublet. The words for animals in the field are Old English, cow, pig, sheep, calf, deer. The words for the meat on the table are Norman French: beef from bœuf, pork from pork, mutton from mouton, veal from veau, venison from venaison. Anglo-Saxon peasants raised the animals. Norman lords consumed the products. The two populations spoke different languages, and the language preserved that difference in vocabulary form that persists today. Every time someone orders beef rather than cow meat, they are speaking a distinction that was created by conquest. The legal and governmental vocabulary of the English-speaking world arrived with William's army. The words that define how courts function, how governments operate, how justice is formally pursued: judge, court, justice, evidence, parliament, sovereign, government, prison, are Norman French in origin. The common law system that would spread to England's colonies, including the 13 that became the United States, was built on administrative foundations that the Normans imposed and the English adapted. The words Americans use in courtrooms and legislatures carry Norman French roots that trace back to October 14th, 1066. The scale of this linguistic transformation is documented. Modern linguistic analysis estimates that over 1/3 of all English words derive from French, the highest proportion of any foreign language influence in English's history. Baugh's assessment was that the influence of French on English was greater than that of any other language. William the Conqueror, who could not speak English and was by contemporary account illiterate, altered the English language more profoundly than any individual before or since. A paradox that the history of conquest regularly produces, in which those who destroy a culture leave their deepest marks on it. Old English didn't disappear. It went underground, endured, and re-emerged transformed. The English that came back in the 13th and 14th centuries was neither pure Old English nor Norman French, but a hybrid of both. Richer, stranger, and more capacious than either of its parents. Middle English carried the grammatical bones of its Germanic inheritance and the vocabulary wealth of its French occupation, producing a language with an expressiveness that few others can match. Chaucer wrote in it. Shakespeare refined it. Every English speaker today speaks a language whose character was permanently shaped by a battle fought in one October day on a ridge in East Sussex. The shield wall fell, and the language changed. Harold Godwinson was not a bad commander. This bears stating clearly, because the narrative of his defeat sometimes slides into treating him as the architect of his own inevitable destruction. A man whose flaws made the outcome foreordained. The evidence doesn't support that reading. Stamford Bridge was a tactical masterpiece. Harold covered nearly 200 miles in 4 to 5 days, caught an invading force of thousands completely off guard, killed both enemy commanders in a single engagement, and reduced a fleet of 300 ships to a remnant of 24. Less than a month later, he was dead. The same commander, the same army. Catastrophically different outcome. Understanding why requires looking not at Harold's character, but at his decisions, and at the specific circumstances those decisions created. The first consequential decision was made on September 8th, where Harold dismissed his militia and his fleet from the south coast, after weeks of waiting for an invasion that hadn't come. This was defensible. Provisions were running out, harvest time had arrived, and his forces couldn't remain indefinitely in the field. 3 weeks later, it proved fatal. William landed on September 28th against an essentially empty coastline, with 2 weeks to establish his beachhead before Harold could reach him. Had Harold been able to contest the landing, the campaign might have looked entirely different. Military historians note, however, that Harold had no means of knowing the timing of William's crossing. The decision to stand down was reasonable given what he knew on September 8th. The second decision was the speed of his southward movement after Stamford Bridge. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's testimony is unambiguous. Harold fought at Hastings before all the army had come. Edwin and Morcar never arrived. His archers couldn't keep pace. He accepted battle with fewer troops, fewer missile troops, and less rest than a longer preparation period might have secured. Against this, some historians argue that allowing William to break out of his Sussex beachhead and forage more widely across England would have been more costly than confronting him quickly, even with an incomplete army. The debate has not been resolved and probably cannot be. The third decision, refusing Gurth's advice, is the one that sits closest to the battle's psychological center. Harold had options that his brother documented. He refused them. Why a demonstrably strategic commander broke from strategic caution at the precise moment when it mattered most is the question that 11 centuries of historical analysis has not fully answered. What is documented is that the watching of his ancestral lands burn while he remained in the north seems to have operated on Harold in ways that cold calculation might have resisted. He was a man defending not just a kingdom, but a specific place, a specific heritage, a specific identity. And that specificity may have been his undoing. What William did right is a necessary counterpart to this analysis. His combined arms force, archers, infantry, cavalry coordinated in sequence, had multiple mechanisms for winning a battle. If the archers suppressed the defenders, the infantry could break the wall. If the infantry failed, the cavalry could exploit gaps. If direct assault failed, the feigned retreat exploited psychology. Harold's force had one tool: hold the ridge. When that tool was working, it worked brilliantly for 8 hours. When it stopped working, when the herdsmen on the wings, exhausted and deceived by the feigned retreats, began breaking formation, there was nothing to fall back to. Harold arrived at Hastings with the wrong tools for the opponent he faced, at the wrong moment after the campaign he'd just fought, without the archers who might have suppressed Norman cavalry long enough to matter. William arrived with the right combination: rested, prepared, commanding an army specifically designed to defeat exactly what Harold brought. The outcome was not predetermined. The shield wall held for 8 hours. Had Harold's archers been present, had the Fyrd maintained its discipline through the afternoon, had the second feigned retreat failed as the first had, the equation might have resolved differently. But history does not operate on conditional tenses. The shield wall eroded. Harold fell. And William, trembling in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, became the king that English history still measures everything against. The Battle of Hastings ended before dinner on October 14th, 1066. It has been studied, debated, reconstructed, and argued over by military historians, battlefield archaeologists, medieval scholars, and amateur enthusiasts ever since. A span of nearly 1,000 years of attention that shows no signs of diminishing. The question is why? Most battles fade from active scholarly interest once the political situation they produced has been superseded by subsequent events. Hastings has not faded, partly because of its consequence. The Norman conquest transformed England so completely that its effects are still traceable in the language and institutions of nations that didn't exist for centuries after the battle. And partly because it is a masterclass in several principles of warfare that military institutions still teach and study today. The first principle that Hastings demonstrates with unusual clarity is the decisive advantage of combined arms over single-capability forces. William's army could adapt and evolve. When archers failed to break the shield wall, infantry advanced. When infantry was repulsed, cavalry charged. When direct assault proved inadequate, psychological manipulation through the feigned retreat was available. Harold's army had one capability: stand and hold. When that capability was intact, it was extraordinary. 8 hours of resistance against everything William could deploy is remarkable by any historical standard. When it eroded through attrition and the feigned retreats, there was nothing to replace it. Modern military doctrine's emphasis on the integration of different capabilities to create mutual support and prevent any single counter traces its theoretical lineage through engagements like Hastings, where the principle was demonstrated at full scale with immediate, decisive consequences. The second principle is the weaponization of psychology in warfare. The feigned retreat was not simply a tactic for killing additional English soldiers, and it was an instrument for degrading the psychological coherence of the shield wall, for introducing doubt, overconfidence, and broken formation into a defense that was holding. Modern military doctrine formally addresses what it calls psychological operations, the systematic effort to influence enemy decision-making through information, deception, and the manipulation of perceptions. The principle is identical to what William's cavalry executed on October 14th. The technology is different. The underlying mechanism is the same. The third principle is more sobering. Harold was arguably a better tactical commander than he was a strategic one on this specific campaign. Or, more precisely, the strategic circumstances he faced constrained his tactical options until they were insufficient for the problem. His handling of Stamford Bridge shows what he was capable of when his preparation matched his opponent. His handling of Hastings shows what happens when a commander arrives at the decisive engagement depleted by the decisions that preceded it. Tactical brilliance on the battlefield cannot fully compensate for strategic errors in preparation and positioning. Military historians identify this as one of Hastings's most transferable lessons. The battle is usually decided before the first arrow flies, by the decisions that determined who arrived where, with what. The battlefield today is managed by English Heritage at Battle Abbey in East Sussex, approximately 7 miles from the coastal town whose name the battle carries. The abbey ruins are substantial. A 13th century extension of the great church still stands, and the imposing gatehouse anchors Battle High Street. An annual reenactment held on the weekend nearest October 14th draws over 20,000 visitors, with hundreds of costumed participants recreating the shield wall and cavalry charges on the slope where the original fighting occurred. The Herald Stone, a simple rectangular plaque set into the earth, marks the traditional site of the high altar, the spot where Harold supposedly fell. Walking the battlefield trail that English Heritage has laid out across the ridge, visitors can still read the terrain that determined everything. The slope is gentler than it was in 1066, modified by 9 centuries of construction and landscaping. But the fundamental geography is recognizable. The ridge running east to west, the flanking woodland, joins the valley below where the Norman army assembled before their first charge at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning in the autumn of 1066. No significant battlefield artifacts have been recovered. Less than 1% of the site has been archaeologically investigated. The bones of the men who died here, English and Norman, housecarl and herdsman, cavalry knight and infantryman, have returned to the soil without leaving traces that our techniques can yet identify with confidence. Only the landscape remains and the lessons it carries. On Christmas Day 1066, a man who had just conquered a kingdom sat trembling on his throne, while his own guards burned the city around him. We understand now what that image means in ways we couldn't at the beginning of this account. William trembled not because he was weak, but because he had just discovered what victory actually is. Not the end of uncertainty, but its transformation into a different kind. He had crossed the channel. He had held his nerve at the height of the battle when his own left wing collapsed and the rumor of his death ran through his army. He had watched the shield wall erode through 8 hours of grinding, costly combat. He had made decisions in the afternoon lull that changed the course of English history. And now he sat in a church filling with smoke, surrounded by people fleeing his own guard's panic. And he understood that he had won something enormous and terrifyingly fragile. Harold Godwinson lay on Senlac Ridge, identified by a woman who had known him for 20 years by marks she alone recognized. His brothers lay near him. His housecarls lay around his standard. The shield wall that had held for 8 hours was gone, and the civilization it had been defending was in the process of being replaced at a pace and depth that no one standing on that October field could fully have understood. The accounting that followed tells the story in numbers that historians have spent centuries refining. Approximately 2,000 Norman dead, historians estimate, perhaps more. Approximately 4,000 English dead, perhaps considerably more. Virtually none of the thousands of English landowning families that the Domesday Survey would locate in 1066 records remained intact by 1086. One October afternoon started a chain of consequences that took 20 years to complete and 960 years to begin to fully map. And the language you are hearing right now carries October 14th, 1066 in its structure. The word government came with William's army. Parliament came with William's army. Justice came with William's army. Every time an English speaker appears in a courtroom, addresses a legislature, orders beef instead of cow, uses the word sovereign or judge or evidence, they are speaking a language permanently altered by a battle fought on a ridge in East Sussex before dinner on a Saturday. The shield wall held for 8 hours. 8 hours of England defending itself against a future that was coming regardless. With the tools it had available and the commander it had chosen, on ground it had selected, and a position it had earned. 8 hours. Then it didn't hold. And the future arrived. The ruins of Battle Abbey still stand. The Harold stone still marks where the king fell. The slope is gentler than it was. The landscape is quieter. But the decisions made on that ridge, Harold refusing Gurth's advice, William ordering his archers to change their angle of fire, Norman cavalry wheeling to cut down English herdsmen who had broken ranks believing they were winning. Those decisions are still present. In the language, in the legal system, in the institutional architecture of nations that trace their political inheritance to the kingdom William built on what Harold defended. One October afternoon. One shield wall, one decision that couldn't be unmade. And nothing, not the English language, not the common law, not the course of a civilization, was ever the same again.